Some of the most exhausting battles you'll ever fight happen entirely inside your own mind. You could be surrounded by peace, yet still feel restless. You could have nothing wrong in your life, yet still carry the weight of 1,000 worries. And what's worse, most of that weight was never yours to begin with. We carry past conversations, future fears, assumptions, judgments and expectations, layer after layer, thought after thought. It doesn't show on our faces, but it quietly drains us day after day. And yet in the middle of all this chaos there is a path that leads to clarity, a path that Buddha walked himself and offered to the world, not through force, but through stillness. Not through control, but through letting go. Today, we're not just going to talk about overthinking or emotional noise. We're going to unravel it from its roots. Using Buddhist teachings that have guided people for thousands of years, we'll explore how to find peace not by changing the world around us, but by softening the world within us. So stay with me. Don't skip ahead. Every part of this journey is like a stepping stone, and missing even one can leave you stuck in the same patterns. And if what we share here brings you even a moment of calm or insight, there's one simple, free way to support this space. Hit the subscribe button. It's a small act, but it means everything to those of us trying to create something meaningful in a world that's always rushing. Let's begin this journey inward, together. It's strange how we can feel exhausted without doing anything physical. You sit down to rest and yet your mind keeps spinning, dragging you through conversations from last week, worries about next month, and 100 other things that haven't even happened. You try to relax, but your thoughts have already pulled you into a storm. That's the trap so many of us fall into every day, a mind that doesn't know how to stop. And most of the time we don't even notice how deep we've gone into it until we're overwhelmed, anxious, or drained. That's the quiet grip of mental looping, thinking the same things in the same way over and over, expecting peace, but only finding more chaos. Buddha spoke of this very cycle. He called it the monkey mind, a restless state where thoughts jump from one branch to another, never settling, never truly arriving. And what's interesting is that most people don't realize how much their suffering comes not from the situation itself, but from the way their minds keep replaying it. Something happens, someone says something hurtful, or a plan doesn't work out, and instead of letting it pass, we revisit it again and again. We try to analyze it, control it, make sense of it, as if thinking harder will fix it. But what it often does is dig the wound deeper. At the core of this is a deep desire to protect ourselves. Our minds believe that if we keep thinking about a problem, we'll somehow be safe. If we replay the past, we'll find a way to prevent it from happening again. If we rehearse the future, we can avoid failure or pain. But this is where Buddhist wisdom gently steps in and says, this is not protection, it's imprisonment. The harder we try to think our way out of suffering, the more entangled we become in it. Thoughts multiply, stress builds, and still we feel no closer to peace. So what do we do when our own minds become the source of our suffering? In Buddhism, the answer lies not in force, but in awareness. Buddha didn't teach us to silence the mind with pressure. He taught us to observe it with compassion. When we become aware of the loop, we create space between ourselves and the thought. It's the difference between being lost in a movie and suddenly remembering we're just watching a screen. That tiny shift in awareness can be powerful. It reminds us, I am not this way of thinking. I am the awareness that sees it. This is where the practice of mindfulness becomes a tool of transformation. Mindfulness allows us to catch the loop in real time. You notice yourself spiraling, and instead of following the thought down its usual path, you pause, you breathe, you watch it like a cloud moving through the sky. You don't grab it, you don't fight it, you simply let it be. And in doing that, the loop begins to weaken, the grip loosens. Another practice rooted in Buddhist teaching is returning to the body. Often, when our minds are looping, our bodies are tense. Shoulders are tight, breathing is shallow, the jaw is clenched. Coming back to your breath, feeling your feet on the ground, softening your posture, it's all a way of stepping out of the storm and coming home to this moment. Buddha emphasized this connection, reminding us that mindfulness isn't only about watching the mind, but also about being fully present in our experience, in the here and now. Over time, as you become more familiar with these practices, the mental loops don't disappear completely, but they lose their power. You catch them earlier. You believe them less. You become kinder to yourself in the process. And gradually, you begin to see that peace isn't somewhere in the future after you've solved all your problems. It's available now, in the space between thoughts, in the pause, in the stillness that arises when you stop running and simply sit with what is. There's something deeply human about wanting things to go our way. We make plans, we imagine outcomes, and we hope the world responds the way we think it should. And when it doesn't, when people act differently than we expected, when life takes a turn we didn't see coming, we often feel shaken. Not because the change itself is unbearable, but because we thought we had control. It's one of the most persistent illusions we live with, that if we try hard enough, plan carefully enough, or think about it long enough, we can shape the world exactly how we want it to be. But the truth is, life isn't designed that way, and that's not a flaw. It's a kind of freedom we're slow to recognize. In the teachings of the Buddha, one of the most transformative truths we're invited to understand is anicca, impermanence. Everything changes. Everything. People, emotions, situations, even our own thoughts. What feels urgent today may be forgotten tomorrow. What seems painful now may teach us the deepest compassion later. The discomfort we feel when life veers off course usually comes from our resistance to this truth. We want stability in a world that is constantly shifting. But as Buddha taught, clinging to what cannot be held leads only to suffering. The more we grip, the more it slips. And the tighter we hold, the more it hurts. Think about how much mental energy goes into trying to control the uncontrollable. We replay conversations in our heads, trying to perfect what was already said. We obsess over how someone might react to something that hasn't even happened. We try to map every step of the future, believing that if we can just think ahead enough, we can avoid discomfort or disappointment. But what if we redirected that energy? What if, instead of trying to manage every outcome, we learned to meet each moment with presence, curiosity, and trust? Buddhism offers us that path. It teaches us to shift from control to awareness. When we begin to let go of the need to control, we don't become passive, we become peaceful. We stop bracing for life and start flowing with it. We stop measuring our success by how closely life follows our script and begin to find joy in the parts that surprise us. The Buddha himself gave up a life of royalty, comfort, and certainty in exchange for truth. He let go of control to discover wisdom, and through that surrender he awakened. Letting go doesn't mean we stop caring, it means we stop believing that our peace depends on everything going perfectly. It means we release the false belief that we are at the center of every storm. When things go wrong, it's not always because we failed. When people change, it doesn't always mean we did something wrong. The universe doesn't revolve around our expectations. It moves in rhythms far beyond our understanding. And when we learn to trust those rhythms, something in us begins to soften. There's a beautiful freedom that arises when you accept that you're not in charge of everything. You start to breathe easier. You stop taking things so personally. You start seeing challenges not as punishments but as part of the unfolding. And the irony is, the less you try to control, the more peace you feel. You begin to trust that you can handle what comes, that you don't need to know the whole path to take the next step, that the present moment, just as it is enough. There's a certain kind of quiet strength that doesn't come from having all the answers, but from knowing how to return to yourself when everything else feels like it's spinning. We all have those moments when life pulls us in every direction, when the noise is too loud, when our minds feel like a battlefield of thoughts competing for attention. You might be sitting in a room full of people or alone in your home and still feel scattered, overwhelmed, or deeply disconnected. And the more you try to figure it out, the more tangled it becomes. But what if the answer isn't in fixing, analyzing, or controlling? What if it's in pausing, noticing, and just being? Buddha understood this well. He didn't teach us to run from the storm or pretend it wasn't there. He taught us to sit with it, fully, mindfully, and without judgment. Mindfulness in the Buddhist path is not some fancy spiritual skill that only monks practice in silence. It's the ability to come home to yourself, right here, right now, without rushing to change anything, without needing the moment to be perfect. It's a practice of meeting life as it is, with open eyes and an open heart. You see, mindfulness isn't about escaping pain or avoiding stress. It's about anchoring yourself in the present so that you don't get swept away by every thought, emotion, or external pressure. When we're not mindful, we live in reaction, constantly pulled by the past or pushed by the future. But when we are mindful, even the smallest action becomes sacred. Drinking tea, washing your hands, listening to someone without needing to speak, breathing. These become doorways back into the present moment, which is the only place peace has ever existed. Think of mindfulness like the roots of a great tree. The wind may blow, the rain may pour, but the tree doesn't fall because it is anchored deep into the earth. In the same way, when we cultivate mindfulness, we're not avoiding life's storms, we're learning how to stand in them without being knocked over. The Buddha once said, "Just as a rock is not shaken by the wind, the wise are not shaken by praise or blame." That steadiness doesn't come from control, it comes from presence. When we practice mindfulness, even our suffering changes. We stop being afraid of our emotions. Instead of resisting anger, fear, sadness, or anxiety, we simply observe it, not from a place of numbness, but from a place of compassionate awareness. "Ah, here is sadness," we say gently to ourselves. "Here is fear." And we breathe with it. Stay with it. Let it be seen. And slowly, like a knot that loosens with warmth, the tension begins to soften. This is not denial, it's deep seeing. It's meeting our experience with the same kindness we'd offer to a hurting friend. Over time, this simple practice becomes a way of life. We start showing up differently, not because we've forced change, but because we're living more consciously. We pause before reacting. We breathe before speaking. We listen more deeply. We judge less quickly. Our presence becomes more nourishing, not only for ourselves, but for everyone around us. Mindfulness doesn't make the world less chaotic, but it makes our hearts more spacious. And in that space, wisdom can arise. There's a quiet kind of pain that comes from holding on too long to people who have already let go of us, to past versions of ourselves, to expectations that never came true. We do it without realizing, convinced that clinging gives us some sense of control or comfort. But what if the very thing we think is keeping us safe is actually what's keeping us stuck? This is something the Buddha understood deeply. He didn't just teach about suffering, he taught the cause of it. And one of the most powerful causes? Attachment. The deep inner grasping we do, often without noticing, because we fear change more than we fear pain. Letting go doesn't mean we stop caring. It doesn't mean we become cold, distant, or indifferent. It means we stop trying to force things to be what they're not. It means we stop believing that our happiness depends on one specific outcome, one specific person, or one perfect plan. In Buddhism, this letting go is not passive, it's an act of courage. It's choosing to loosen your grip on what hurts, so your hands and your heart can be free to receive peace. The Buddha once said, "You only lose what you cling to." That one line has stayed with me, because it's not about loss in the traditional sense. It's about the illusion of possession, the idea that we can hold life still when life is always moving. When you begin to let go, you start to notice something almost magical. Your mind becomes lighter. The stories you've been telling yourself over and over about who hurt you, what should have happened, what you deserve, start to lose their grip. It's not that the memories vanish or the feelings disappear. It's that they stop running the show. You no longer wake up and carry the same emotional weight into every moment. You start to breathe differently. You start to respond rather than react. You begin to find peace, not because your life is finally perfect, but because you no longer expect it to be. In Buddhist teachings, letting go is part of the path to liberation. Not just liberation from pain, but from the self-made stories that keep pain alive. We're taught to observe our attachments gently, without judgment, and ask, is this helping me grow or is it holding me back? Is this feeling rooted in truth or in fear? The practice isn't about getting rid of everything. It's about becoming aware of what we're clinging to and understanding why. And when you get to the root, you often find it's not really about the other person or the outcome or the past. It's about something deeper, our need for safety, for certainty, for love. And the beautiful thing is, the more you let go, the more you gain. You gain space, you gain clarity, you gain a deeper connection to the present. Letting go is not about having less, it's about making room for what truly matters, for peace, for acceptance, for the ability to live your life fully, even if it looks nothing like what you imagined. That's the heart of Buddhist wisdom. It's not a promise that you won't face loss. It's a reminder that you don't have to be lost in it. Letting go isn't something we do once, it's a practice, a return to the now, again and again, until we finally realize this moment, just as it is already enough. There's a moment in everyone's life when you start to wonder, why does my own mind feel like the loudest enemy? You sit in silence, hoping for peace, but instead, thoughts pour in like a storm, some small and harmless, others sharp and heavy. It's easy to feel like your mind is against you. But the truth is, your mind is not broken. It's just never been taught how to be still. In Buddhism, the mind isn't seen as something to fight. It's something to understand. The Buddha never asked us to silence the mind forcefully. He invited us to observe it gently, with compassion. Most of us grow up believing that we are our thoughts. If the mind says something painful, we accept it as truth. If it says we're not enough, we believe it. If it predicts failure, we prepare for it. But Buddhist teachings remind us of a powerful truth. Thoughts are just passing visitors. They're not the essence of who we are. You are the awareness that sees them. Like clouds drifting through the sky, thoughts come and go, some light and fluffy, others stormy and dark, but the sky remains untouched. That sky is your true self. The mistake we often make is confusing the clouds for the sky itself. The Buddha referred to this mental activity as the monkey mind, a restless, unsettled mind that jumps from one idea to another. But he didn't say the monkey was bad. He simply said it was untrained. When left alone, it gets into mischief, but when trained with mindfulness, it becomes a tool for wisdom. That's where the transformation begins. Not by silencing thoughts completely, but by learning not to follow every single one. You observe, you breathe, you let the thought rise and fall without attaching your identity to it. Sometimes it's not even the content of the thought that hurts, it's our relationship to it. We fight it, we argue with it, we try to force it away. But the more we resist, the more power it gains. Buddhism teaches us a softer, more effective way to watch the mind with curiosity instead of judgment. What if instead of saying, "Why am I thinking this?" you asked, "What is this thought trying to show me?" Sometimes thoughts rise out of fear, sometimes out of memory, sometimes out of unmet needs. When you bring awareness without aggression, the mind starts to soften. The thoughts lose their grip. There's also something freeing in realizing that not every thought needs your attention. Some are useful, some are noisy, and some are just echoes of old patterns you've outgrown. In meditation, we practice noticing these thoughts without reacting. The Buddha didn't promise that thoughts would disappear, but he did promise that freedom lies in our ability to stop clinging to them. We don't have to follow every storyline. We don't have to solve every internal debate. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is let the thought pass like a leaf floating down a river. One of the most healing parts of Buddhist practice is this: learning to sit with the mind as it is, without trying to fix it. Just being with yourself fully, without needing to change or perfect anything in that moment. That's where real transformation happens. When the mind knows it's safe, it begins to settle. Not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped feeding it with fear. There's a quiet kind of suffering that many of us carry, and it hides beneath the surface of our everyday lives. It's not loud or obvious, but it shows up in the way we speak to ourselves when we make a mistake. It's in the discomfort we feel when someone compliments us. It's in the way we keep proving, performing, and pleasing just to feel like we're enough. And what's most painful about it is that it often begins within. So many of us are at war with ourselves without even realizing it. But the teachings of the Buddha remind us. The path to peace doesn't start outside of us. It begins within, in how we relate to our own hearts. In Buddhism, one of the most powerful and healing practices is metta, or loving kindness. It's a practice that invites us to send goodwill and compassion not just to others, but first to ourselves. It might sound simple, but for many people, this is the hardest part, directing love inward. Why? Because somewhere along the way, we learned that love must be earned. We believed we had to achieve, fix, or perfect ourselves before we were worthy of kindness. But Buddha never said we needed to become someone else in order to be whole. He simply pointed us back to our true nature, one of awareness, compassion, and peace. Think about how you treat yourself when you fall short of your own expectations. The critical voice that says you're not good enough, not doing enough, not strong enough. That voice has been rehearsed for years. And yet if a friend came to you with the same struggle, you would never speak to them the way you speak to yourself. This is where Buddhist wisdom becomes deeply transformative. It invites you to question the stories you've been told about your worth. It asks you to stop treating yourself like a problem to solve and start seeing yourself as a human to embrace. Loving yourself without conditions doesn't mean you ignore your flaws or stop growing. It means that your growth is rooted in compassion, not in shame. When we practice loving kindness toward ourselves, we begin to soften. We stop trying to punish ourselves into becoming better. Instead, we nurture the parts of us that are hurting. Buddha taught that just as a mother protects her child with her life, we must develop that same fierce and gentle compassion for our own minds and hearts. You don't need to have it all figured out to be worthy of love. You don't need to fix every mistake or silence every doubt. You are allowed to be a work in progress and still be deeply deserving of care. The lotus flower is one of the most beautiful symbols in Buddhism, not because it grows in perfection, but because it blooms from the mud. Your journey, your mess, your vulnerability, that's what makes your compassion real. And the more you allow yourself to receive love, especially your own, the more you naturally share it with others, without effort or fear. One of the simplest ways to begin this practice is through words. Place your hand on your heart and say gently, "May I be kind to myself. May I forgive myself. May I accept myself just as I am." At first, it may feel awkward, even false, but stay with it. Just like a garden needs time to bloom, your heart needs time to trust this new voice. Over time, those words become not just a practice, but a truth you live from. It's easy to look at your life and think, I need a complete reset. Maybe it feels like everything has piled up, bad habits, emotional wounds, missed goals, and the only way out is to do something drastic. But what if I told you that change doesn't happen through grand gestures or overnight breakthroughs? It happens in the quiet, in the ordinary, in the everyday choices we make when no one's watching. In Buddhism, this is one of the most grounding truths. Transformation isn't about becoming someone else. It's about returning to who you've always been, beneath all the noise and conditioning. Buddha never promised instant enlightenment. In fact, his own journey was long and filled with inner challenges. He didn't wake up one morning completely wise and awakened. It took years of practice, self-inquiry, silence, discipline, and compassion. And that's something many of us forget. Real change is slow, and it's meant to be. Like a seed turning into a tree, you don't see the growth each day, but over time, it becomes undeniable. That's how true transformation works. It's not flashy, but it's deep. It doesn't demand attention, but it commands respect. One of the biggest misconceptions about personal growth is that it has to feel big to be real, that if you're not having major life revelations or changing your entire routine, you're not making progress. But Buddha taught that even a single thought, when guided by mindfulness and compassion, can shift your entire inner landscape. The simple act of breathing with awareness is already a step toward awakening. The moment you choose kindness instead of anger, patience instead of reaction, or silence instead of gossip, you're walking the path. We often wait for a perfect moment to change, when we're less busy, when we feel more motivated, when life finally slows down. But Buddhism reminds us that there is no perfect moment, because the only moment we ever truly have is now, not the idea of now, not the hope for a better version of now, just this breath, this thought, this choice. You don't have to wait to start, you're already on the path. Even your desire to grow is part of the change unfolding within you. And let's be honest, real change also means facing discomfort. It means being willing to sit with yourself, especially when the old patterns want to pull you back. Buddha faced his fears under the Bodhi tree. He didn't avoid them. He looked directly at the illusions, the cravings, the fears, and he stayed. That's the heart of transformation. It's not about becoming fearless. It's about seeing fear clearly and still choosing the path of wisdom. When you stop running, when you face what's real without judgment, something softens, and that softening is what lets light in. Another important part of change is compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. You will mess up. You will forget everything you promised yourself. You'll slip into old thoughts and habits. But the practice is not about perfection. It's about returning, again and again, gently and without shame. Buddha never asked for flawless followers. He asked for honest seekers. And if you can meet yourself with love, especially in your messiest moments, then you are practicing something deeper than self-help. You're practicing liberation. Sometimes we keep looking for signs, hoping that life will suddenly show us the next step, the right answer, the thing that will finally make us feel whole. We ask other people for guidance. We scroll endlessly, searching for something we can't quite name. We think the solution must be out there, somewhere just beyond our reach. But the truth is, what you're searching for isn't outside you. It never was. The real turning point begins the moment you stop running from yourself and start sitting with what's already inside. Buddha taught that the path to liberation is not found in the external world. It's discovered in the stillness of our own hearts. He didn't ask us to become someone else or chase a version of perfection. He simply pointed inward and said, "Look here." And that teaching, though simple, is life-changing. It tells us that peace, clarity, and even healing are not something we have to earn or find. They're already part of us. But to access them, we must first pause long enough to listen. We live in a world that convinces us we're incomplete. It constantly whispers that we need to be better, do more, prove our worth. But Buddhism reminds us that underneath all the layers of fear, doubt, and pressure, there's a deeper self, untouched, unshaken, already whole. The way forward isn't about becoming someone new, it's about returning to that part of you that already knows peace. It's not about fixing what's broken. It's about realizing that you are not the brokenness, you are the one observing it. That shift, even if it sounds small, changes everything. Instead of reacting to every thought or emotion, you begin to witness them with compassion. You no longer get swept away by every wave because you've remembered that you are the ocean. This is the essence of Buddhist practice. It's not about escaping life, it's about meeting life more fully, with presence, with clarity, with kindness. One of the most powerful tools on this path is mindfulness, not just as a technique but as a way of being. When you sit with yourself, your breath, your body, your feelings, you start to build a relationship with the part of you that's steady. That part doesn't panic when things fall apart. It doesn't chase validation. It simply watches with patience and understanding. And the more time you spend in that space, the more naturally peace begins to rise from within. But this journey inward isn't always comfortable. Sometimes when we turn inward, we don't find silence. We find pain, old wounds, memories, guilt, fear. Buddha never promised the path would be easy. He only promised that it would be worth it. When we meet our suffering with presence instead of avoidance, something begins to soften. The pain doesn't control us anymore. We begin to carry it differently, with awareness, with grace, with freedom. And slowly we stop needing the world to change so we can feel okay, because we've created space inside ourselves that nothing can shake. That's what the path offers, not a perfect life, but an unshakable mind. A heart that stays soft even in the face of hardship. A spirit that chooses love over fear, again and again. The most profound journeys don't begin with a step forward. They begin with a step inward. If something in today's message stirred your heart or quieted your mind, let it guide you gently to the next part of your path. There's another teaching waiting for you on the screen, one that may be exactly what your soul is ready for. Thank you for walking this path with me and for being a part of Buddhist journey. Your presence here truly matters. Until next time, may your steps be steady and your heart remain open.